We petition you now to come to us and be with us, to be present in this place as we worship, and that the preaching of your word would be effective in yielding fruit that is pleasing to you. Lord, we long for the day that where everyone at the sound of my voice is not just online, but in person, in a local church, connected to God's people, recognizing that that day will be different for everyone, but praying that that day would be soon. So God, now I just ask that you would be with me, that you would protect this congregation from me, but that you would speak through me, and all that comes from your word or from your spirit would yield just as you intend, in Jesus' name. Amen. You know, this has been a hard week for me. Deb was just asking me, am I okay? And I said, no. No, I'm not okay. But that's okay. You know, there were a couple of hard things that happened this week. I've had a couple of hard conversations this week that would make anyone whose relationship with the Lord is not right question his goodness. I mean, heck, I'm a pastor, and I have to continually remind myself that God is good even when unspeakable wickedness and unspeakable loss occurs, both of which have happened this week. I also have to remind myself that I'm hearing the Lord. I'm going to tell you a story, and it might take a while. I've been praying a lot recently in this season, the same prayer that I think is driving my wife crazy, which is, God, I want to hear your voice. That's all she's hearing me say right now. Lord, I want to hear your spirit. I want to hear your voice. I want to know that you are close and that you are with me like your word promises. I don't know what this next season looks like for Anthem Church, but I need to know that I'm hearing your voice. And so I keep telling my wife this. This is what I want to hear. This is what I want to know. This is what I want to sense. And that, so that when hard things happen, that I am confident that the Lord is still in that as well. And so this one day, I had to take my car in to be serviced, and in a house full of 4 drivers, you think I would be able to find somebody to take me to go pick up the car. I'm paying for everybody's insurance. Nobody can take me. How is it that it's resorted to me needing an Uber to go pick up my car? Which is what I did. I scheduled an Uber. Now, I scheduled this Uber for 4:45 p.m. That's important. I had to stay with my son Tyler, who is disabled, until 4:45 p.m. That's the window in which the nurse transitions out of the home, our full-time nurse, and my wife comes back from Antioch, where she's doing an internship with Kaiser, comes back into the home. And so I'm sitting on my favorite chair, and I am praying that prayer. God, I want to hear your voice. I want to know that you're close. And my phone notification goes on, and I immediately become indignant that my phone has interrupted this prayer of mine, and it's Uber of all things telling me my driver is on the way. The time is 4:05. Now, I have scheduled and I have said very clearly, using their app, following their instructions, that I will not be ready until when? 4:45. So the app allows me to send a message directly to my driver, which I do, and I say to him, I cannot get outside of my house any earlier than 4:45. which is what I scheduled. So now I'm bothered that this Uber driver has interrupted my spiritual time with the Lord. So I send the message and I go right back to my Zen. And then the phone goes off again. And it says, your Uber driver is approaching. It is 4:15 p.m., 30 minutes before I scheduled him to arrive. And so I said, this is what I'm doing in my heart, okay? In my heart, I'm like, fine, you just sit there. I'm not messaging you anymore. I'm not calling. You just sit there while I talk to Jesus. You just sit there, all right? Jerk. This is what's all going on inside of me. So I'm like, either he's going to leave and I'm going to have to schedule another one, which is going to be annoying, or he's just going to sit on his fat face and wait for me to be done praying to Jesus, okay? And for my wife to get home. And so my wife does. Right on schedule. So I get up, I go into the kitchen to get my water bottle. It is now 4:45 p.m. and I look outside the window. And there he is. Still sitting there. Half an hour later, which Uber drivers do not do. So I grab my stuff. I walk out the door. My wife and I pass like ships in the night. She goes in, I go out. As I'm approaching my Uber driver, I see out of the corner of my eye, in the passenger side rear view mirror, that he sees me approaching and he scrambles and shuffles and shoves something under the passenger side seat that he doesn't want me to see. I'm like, this is fantastic. I've interrupted a drug deal gone wrong. This is the kind of stuff I dream about. This is the kind of stuff that you end up on reality TV for. I can't wait. This is the perfect sermon metaphor. This is great. So I get in the car, and he starts driving me to Novato Chevrolet. He's a kind man. He's a gentle man. By the time we pull onto the 101, I hear this voice in my head. That was a Bible. To which I reply, thinking I'm talking to myself, Alan, what do you want me to do about it? I can't do anything with that information. Because if you're right, Alan, or if you're wrong, that's really awkward conversation with someone in Marin County. Even if you're right, still an awkward conversation with somebody, okay? And this goes on for miles. That was a Bible. So eventually I'm saying to myself, I don't think I'm talking to myself. Lord, I don't know what you want me to do with this information. And he says again, that was a Bible, and this man is a Christian. So do your duty. So after fighting, after praying to God that I would hear his voice, I am still wrestling with whether I want to obey. Now that I've heard it, convincing myself that maybe I just can't hear God's voice and that's my own head. So finally, as we pass Hamilton, I muster up enough courage to say to this man, hey, was that a Bible? If you've been in this church at all, you know that I am off of the stage, I'm a very socially awkward human being, and I wish I could say to you I said that differently, but I did not say that differently. And he's driving, and he's like, "What?" and I was like, "I say again, was that a Bible?" And so this very sweet man turns and looks at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes are as big as he can make them. And he says to me, "How on earth could you know that?" Yes, it is. He's a black Haitian man who immigrated here to the United States. And through his own story, he proceeded to tell me how God has been kind enough to bring to him other Haitians here in Marin County, and that he is overwhelmed with the responsibility of leading this Bible study that now includes up to 20 Haitian men. But because of COVID, they've had to stop meeting, and they are languishing under their separation, and they just need a place to meet. And so I say to him, "Well, I'm a pastor," and he almost swerves off the road, okay? And I'm like, his name's Willand, and I'm like, Willand, eyes on the road, buddy, eyes on the road. I don't think the Lord brought us together for us to go see him together. So eyes on the road, homie. And so, he almost takes us right off the road. I mean, we almost went into Chick-fil-A the back way, if you know what I mean. And so after he composes himself, he loses his mind. And so I said, Willand, I cannot promise you anything. I cannot guarantee anything. I am just one of 6 pastors at a church, and I have to bring this before them. But I cannot believe that God would be so kind to me in this moment for us to just go our separate ways. Last Sunday, Willand, his wife, and his son sat right there. And you all were very generous and kind to them. And the elders met on Tuesday, and we're going to do everything we can to accommodate this group of men. It's just space. And we've got lots of it, and we're going to try and figure out how to make it work. We don't know how. And here I am praying that I would hear God's voice, and that I would know that God's close, and that I would despise the very interruption that he sends to me to assure me of just that. That's just like Alan Coleman. This is what I want for you. I've preached 2 weeks on desires through Genesis. This week will be the third and crown jewel of that series. What I want for you, Anthem Church, is to know that when you think about all the things that you want for your children, all the things that you want for your family, for your life, for your vocation, they are going to go not according to plan and to your desires most of the time. And if you don't know, if you can't hear his voice, you will despise him, you will separate from him, and you will not experience all the intimacy that the Christian life provides and affords to us supernaturally by God's grace and through God's Son, Jesus Christ. I want you to know. This is a picture of me riding into Death Valley. Now behind me, there's a reason that there's no one on the road and I can take this picture, because at this time of year, nobody wants to go to Death Valley. My best friend Chuck is behind me in this photo, parked on the side of the road, drinking water, which is what my dumb butt should have been doing, not taking pictures. Now, you can leave that up for a little while. How we got here is another funny story. Chuck and I were on a Harley trip across the country, and we were on our way back, and we were trying to decide how best to go home, and we had a choice between two different routes. One of them went around Death Valley and would add another day to trying to get home. And one of them went through Death Valley. And we had a choice to make. And we're trying to make this decision sitting at what we consider a very prophetic part of our motorcycle trips, a Mexican restaurant. And we were eating tacos, and we were debating on whether to go through Death Valley or not. Now, mind you, it is now the beginning of August. So I look on my phone, the temperature for Death Valley. Do not change pictures. Leave this picture up. According to my phone, the temperature in Death Valley is 105. It's hot. It's not that hot. I mean, we've been in hot places on motorcycle trips, and that's not that hot. So we're like, man, this will cut almost a day off of our adventure. And plus, I've never seen Death Valley. I've never been to Death Valley. He's like, neither have I. I don't know why people avoid this place. 105 is not that hot. Let's go. And so we end up on this road that you see in front of you, and it goes down into the valley. And so as about every mile, it gets hotter and hotter as we're heading down into the valley. Now, eventually, after enough miles, I can only describe to you the sensation of opening up an oven door hits you, okay? And so that's when we about pull over in this picture. We pull over and we say, wow, it is a hot 105. Let's just stop for a second. When we finally get into the valley, we find that it's 127 degrees that day. The reason why your phone says 105 is they can't put thermometers, not normal ones, in Death Valley because they melt. So they put them at the top of the valley where it's 105, not at the bottom of the valley where it's 127. Now, go back a picture again. Now, as we're going down into the valley, at different stages, I'm thinking to myself, it's really hot. And I'm looking at Chuck in my rearview mirror, and I'm saying, well, if he's not stopping, I'm not stopping, right? Now, I heard Chuck preach this story in one of his sermons online. And when he preaches at his church this same story, he says this, well, if he's not stopping, I'm not stopping. And we just go plunging into 127 degrees into Death Valley, where people get stranded all the time because it's so hot, it evaporates the fuel in your line. And so what you don't know about Death Valley is you never turn your car off because you may never get it started again. Now, we got out of Death Valley about as fast as I've ever ridden a motorcycle in my life. We went from 127 to 96 in 7 minutes. I've never been that hot in my life. I don't know if you've ever been in 127, but what 127 feels like, it feels like you're a brownie. That's what it feels like, okay? I mean, before Death Valley, I was white. I was white. I came back from Death Valley. I'm white. This is Death Valley here, y'all. I'm just letting you know. Now, why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this story because, listen to me, I am stubborn and obstinate to the core. That is Alan Coleman in a sentence. I am stubborn and I am obstinate, which means I'm going to end up wrestling with God a whole lot. If you ever saw the movie The Goonies, their slogan was this: Goonies never die. But Christians do. The call to the Christian life is to get up every single day and to die. To your desires, to your dreams, to your ambitions, because you hear the voice of God. Matthew 16 says, Jesus told his disciples, if you're going to come after me, you have to deny yourself. And if you want to save your life, you're going to have to die. Surrender is the path out of death's valley. Psalm 23 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, so a spiritual death valley, I will fear no evil, for I know you're with me, because I can hear your voice. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me, and surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. What really satisfies comes through surrender. And surrender does not come easy to Western American elites. And it is the whole paradigm of the Christian life, surrendered life. And so this morning, as I conclude this section of the book of Genesis, what I want to leave with you is, if you want to be fully satisfied, you have to know that you have heard God's voice, and you have to lead a life of complete and total surrender. So, we are going to pick up again in Jacob's story. And we need to be reminded. Do you remember what Jacob wanted most? What did he want more than anything in the world? Blessing. More than anything in the world, what Jacob wanted was blessing. And by blessing, here's what I mean. Esau and Jacob were two sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Esau, the elder son, was the favorite of Isaac, and Jacob was the favorite of Rebekah. Since Esau was the firstborn son, he was entitled to receive both the blessing and the birthright as a member of that family. The birthright was twofold. Number one, it included a double portion of the inheritance from his father. And number two, it included a special ceremonial blessing from his father. And so Jacob did everything to cheat his older brother out of this twofold blessing. The birthright was a natural privilege, and it would have made him head of the family, charge of the family, including the property. He would be responsible for the welfare of the younger sons, the widows, the unmarried daughters, and he would exercise considerable authority over all the other members of the family. It was binding and irrevocable. And here's what I'm going to suggest this morning. You want the same thing as Jacob, to be blessed. To be blessed with authority, to be blessed with position, to be blessed with affirmation, to be blessed with security, to be blessed, to be blessed, to be #blessed. Jacob wants more than anything in the world to be blessed. And so we pick up in Genesis chapter 1. Let's go back to chapter 1. Let's start over. Everybody's like, no. All right. Chapter 32, verse 1. Jacob has now left Laban, his wicked uncle. He finally has his family. He is finally going back to where he is supposed to be. Except if you remember, there's one problem. Who's waiting for Jacob? Esau, the brother that he cheated out of everything, is waiting for him back in that direction. And the last time we heard from Esau is in Genesis 27:41, which reads this: Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him, and Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, and then I will kill my brother Jacob. This is the last time we hear from Esau in relationship to Jacob. And so we pick up with him finally on his way back home. Verse 1:32 says this: Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. Now this is plural. This is not angel of God, which tends to be an Old Testament appearance of Jesus himself, but these are messengers. There's clearly something in the text that is intimating protection over Jacob as he goes on his way. And when Jacob saw them in verse 2, he says, this is God's camp. More appropriately translated, this is God's army, because he's got a lot of men with him, Jacob does, okay? And so he called the name of that place Manaheim, and Jacob sent messengers, not the angels, his messengers from his army, before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, verse 4, say this to my Lord. Okay, please tell me you're catching what's happening here. Please say this to my brother. My Lord Esau. Do you see what he's doing here? Okay, he is now trying to kiss up to his brother because he knows how he has left things. Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban until now, and I have oxen and donkeys and flocks, and oh my, I have sent to tell my Lord, you, Esau, in order that I might find favor in your sight. Do you hear the bribery in his language? Verse 6. And the messengers return to Jacob, so they take this message to Esau, and then they come back, and here's what they say in verse 6. We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you. And there are 400 men with him. And then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Woo! All right. So my first of 3 points is this. Number 1, fear is the enemy of surrender. Fear is the enemy of surrender. Fear is a very powerful emotion, and the first thing that you need to know about fear this morning is that you cannot control fear. You can control desires and state of being, but you cannot control emotions, which fear is. There are 8 emotions: joy, sadness, fear, anger, loneliness, hurt, guilt, and shame. Fear is one of those 8. You can't control it. You can't stop it. You were not intended to. You can only learn from it or be impaired by it. But you cannot control fear. God gave that to you as a gift and a way to navigate a fallen, distorted world. It's a gift to you to be afraid sometimes. So, for example, there are desires, and of which I would say there are subcategories of desires, which is what we've been talking about the last 3 weeks. There are surface desires. I want a Harley. I want a new job. I want dinner from House of Prime Rib. Hot dog, right? There's surface desires. And then there are root desires, deeper level desires that inform those surface desires. The desire for belonging, the desire for security, the desire for significance or for touch. Desires are the object of our perceived happiness, formed by the most compelling narratives or experiences in our lives. That's what a desire is. It is the thing that I think will make me happy, and the reason I think it'll make me happy is because some experience or narrative was imported into my life and has become very compelling. You can control desires. Desires are controlled by supplanting them with more compelling narratives or experiences. Right? 2 weeks ago I told you I sold my Harley because the more compelling desire was to take care of my son. I still desire a Harley, but I desired this more. You can control desires. So desires, states of beings, and emotions. States of beings for example, like feeling peaceful or restless, hopeful or hopeless, are this. States of being are the current perception of our trajectory in relationship to our desires. So when someone expresses a state of being where they say they feel hopeful, it's because they perceive that the trajectory of their experiences is heading in a direction that they're going to get the thing that they want. If they feel hopeless, which is also a state of being, it's because they perceive the trajectory is going in a direction where they might not get what they think will make them happy. Desires, state of being, and then emotions. Emotions, really quickly, state of being can be controlled, and the way you control the way your state of being is by changing perspective. So, for example, if I feel hopeless about a certain thing in my life, that's a state of being, then I have to widen my perspective as a Christian as to God's overarching themes in the life of a Christian and realize that He works all things out for good for those who are called according to His promise. And so I can go from hopeless to hopeful in spite of the trajectory of where things are going. Do we understand? Okay. And then there's emotions. Emotions are our internal response to how we perceive our environment, relationships, and experiences, and the way that they're affecting our desires. It's our internal response to how we perceive our environment, relationships, or experiences are affecting our desires. And your emotions cannot be controlled. Men, if you are saying to your wives or to your daughters or to your little kids, stop being so emotional, you are saddling them with a yoke that will cripple them. They cannot do that. You are an emotive being. You have emotions. God gave them to you as a gift to learn from. It's just most people don't, and they're impaired by them. So a more appropriate response that I don't recommend you saying to your wife is, stop being so impaired by your emotions. Not stop having them. Oh, by the way, gentlemen, in my experience, no one is more impaired by their emotions than the male species. Because you like to pretend you don't have any. And it's not true. So your desires tell you what really matters to you. Your state of being tells you how you think things are going. And your emotions are trying to tell you how to navigate your desires in a healthy way. You cannot control fear because it's an emotion. Now, here's the bad news. Fear can control you. Fear can control you. And what we're about to see is, because Jacob is greatly afraid and distressed, he's going to try everything under the sun to manipulate, to orientate, to mitigate his brother Esau from infringing upon his desire to stay alive and his desire to make a family home for himself back in the land of Canaan. Verse 7 continues on and says this. It says, he divided the people who were with him into two camps, thinking, verse 8, if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. This is an ingenious plan. It's like, we're going to send some of you that way and some of you that way, and he'll only, and whichever one he attacks, the rest of us will get away. Problem with this plan is, you don't know which one he's going to attack, so which one do I hang out in? I don't know. Eeny, meeny, miny, God, right? I don't know how we do this. It's a terrible plan because, number one, your fear can control you because it makes your posture very guarded. And this is what he's doing. He's being very guarded in this decision in dividing these two camps and preparing himself for this impending siege by his brother. Listen, we do this. When we're afraid, we don't fully trust. We start to be guarded with others. For some of you, because of things that have happened to you and are happening to you, your fear is going to impair you in a way where you're going to see every person as a potential threat. Fear makes you try and control your environment and your relationships. See, fear and anger are bedfellows. When I meet an angry person, like myself historically, the longer that you plumb that anger, the more you find out that it's actually fear that causes the anger. Because fear and anger are both about control. Fear is future tense. Something's coming like Esau that I can't control, so now I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what it's going to do. Anger is, it happened. The thing I couldn't control happened. The thing that I couldn't stop happened. And so anger starts to well up in you. Future tense, present tense. Fear, anger. Verse 13. So he stayed there a night. From what he had, he took a present for his brother Esau. He took 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 blah, 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 blah. Then he handed these all to his servants, every drove. And a drove is just like, here's a flock of things, here's a flock of things, here's a flock of things. So he separated these things into droves, and he gives them to his servants, and he says, pass on ahead of me, put a space between drove and drove. Verse 17, and he says, when my brother Esau meets you and asks you to whom you belong, where are you going, and whose are these ahead of you, you shall say, they belong to Jacob. They are a present said to my lord Esau. And moreover, there's more behind us, including Jacob. Verse 20. No, you know what? I'm going to stop there. So here's the second thing he tries. He's going to just assault Esau with gifts. One flock's going to come in, they're going to be like, yeah, look at what Jacob brought you. And just when you're like, no, I'm still going to kill him. And then another one's going to hit you. Look at all these gifts. There's a Maserati, here's a Lamborghini, here's a everything that you want, right? No, I'm still going to kill him. Then you're going to get hit with a third drove of gifts. This is his master plan. Because fear not only controls you by making you guarded, but it controls you by making your interactions manipulative. When you're afraid, one of the ways it controls you is it makes all of your relationships manipulative, because you're trying to neutralize the potential threat that people are to what you want. Ask yourself this. Think about some of the last 10 hard conversations. Oh, that's too many. I'm sorry. Think of it like the last 3 hard conversations you've had. Now, if you're honest, somewhere in there you tried to manipulate them because you were trying to neutralize any threat to what you desire. Fear makes you employ deception and flattery as instruments of warfare in defending your desires. Verse 9. Wait, 9? It's not supposed to be 9. Oh, it's 9 of... 22. I don't know why I wrote 9 through 11. It may not be on the screen because I sent this to Peyton saying verse 9 for some reason. So I'm going to read verse 22. So that same night, he arose and he took his 2 wives. He took 2 female servants and his 11 children, and he crossed the river. And he took them and sent them across, and everything else that he had, all the people, everyone. Everything he sends ahead. And verse 24 says this, Jacob was left alone. Now let me come back to that. Jacob says this prayer earlier in the text, and one of the things that I want to point out what it does with fear is it also makes your faith shallow, because what you'll see here in these verses, it is 9 to 12. I read too much. In verses 9 to 12, he says, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, who said to me, return to your country, to your kindred, that I may do you good. You promised that if I went here, that everything would be good. You promised that if I did what you said, everything would go well." Now, if you look back at the promise, he did say that. But I don't think God meant things will go your way. I think he meant what I do will be good for you. But it's not going to go your way. Because fear makes your faith really shallow. When you start praying to God, instead of saying, your kingdom come, your will be done, you say, my kingdom come, my will be done. Second Timothy says this, God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. 1 John says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out all fear, for fear has to do with punishment. That is literally translated, fear is punishment. Fear itself is a punishment. To just live in fear, doesn't that feel like you're being afflicted all the time when you're anxious, when you're nervous, when you're afraid? Isn't it paralyzing? But here's the good news. Fear also catalyzes something else that is very important to a Christian. Point number 2. Struggle is the engagement of surrender. So number 1, fear is the enemy of surrender. Number 2, struggle, wrestling with God, which is catalyzed by our fear, is how we begin to engage in the process of surrendering. Because fear catalyzes struggle with our faith, which is a necessary component of growth and eventual surrender. So the question that we're going to answer is when someone says, I've been wrestling with God, what should that look like? And we're going to come to a part of a text that so many people and Christians and churches are afraid of, or that are aware of, that they're familiar with. It's just they never read it in its entire context like we're doing this morning. So we come to verse 22, which is where I was just reading, and he sends everyone and everything across the river ahead of him. And in verse 24, it says, Jacob was left alone by himself. Struggle is personal, struggle is prolonged, and struggle is painful. And I think why it's so important that the text is highlighting that Jacob is alone before this key biblical moment happens is that no one can do the wrestling for you. Several weeks ago, I talked about spiritual drafting. At some point, you have to stop drafting behind the preacher, the older brother, your parents, and you need to struggle with God on your own. Struggle is personal. You have to deal with your own fears, your own desires, and how they work in relationship to the God who has made promises to you. And then in verse 24, it goes on and says, a man, literally a stranger, no one is around. It's the pitch dark of the morning. Jacob is by himself. And the text literally reads that a hand seizes him. Now, it's not in the text, but if I'm Jacob, who do I think has come for me? He found me. He's here. It's the middle of the night. Ah! Right? I mean, I would just be terrified at this whole freaking ninja moment in the middle of the dark that Esau's finally here. I feel hair. It's definitely him, right? If you've been with us, you know why that's funny. And it says that he wrestled with this man until the breaking of day, until the sun came up. You need to be prepared for this, for your wrestling about your fears and your desires. You need to be prepared for that to be a long process. There are no shortcuts to wrestling with God. When someone comes to me and says, yeah, I prayed about it for a couple hours. I think this is the will of the Lord. No! I know never mind. Christian struggle. Here's what Christian struggle is. It is the process of reconciling the fears we feel about the desires we have with the promises that God has made. And that takes time. Verse 25. When the man did not prevail against Jacob, and this doesn't, when you read this historically, what people think is like, oh, Jacob's winning. Yeah, so to speak. It's not that the man cannot physically prevail against Jacob. It's that the text is literally trying to say this. Jacob won't surrender himself. He keeps fighting. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with the man. Verse 26, then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. At this point, Jacob is starting to figure out who this man is. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, my name is Jacob. He says, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. If you don't know what Israel means, it's Isra, which means wrestle, and El, as in Elohim, God. Israel means the people who wrestle with God. God's people are literally defined as people who wrestle with God. It is our Christian obligation to wrestle with God. It goes on. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why are you asking my name? This is very, very close to the language in Exodus where he says, you know my name. It's I am. That's all you need to know. Why are you asking my name? And he blessed him. Verse 30, so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. If you remember in Exodus, it says that you cannot see the full glory of God and live. And what Jacob's here saying is, I have just seen God and lived. Well, is the Bible in conflict with itself? No, because what Moses asked for in Exodus is to see the full Shekinah glory of God unmitigated, which would destroy him. Who has Jacob seen? Who keeps showing up in the Old Testament? You're darn right. When you won't surrender, God allows pain. And pain is a better alternative to Death Valley. God allows you to limp. Sometimes we will limp the rest of our lives with what God has allowed to happen to us. But a limp is better than walking away. A limp is better than walking into destruction. A limp, walking with a limp, for some of us, is a reminder that God will take any means necessary to save you. And so the great prophet Shakira was right. Hips don't lie. Final point. Final point. Come on, come on. You all know that was funny. So number one, fear is the enemy of surrender. Number two, struggle is the engagement of surrender. And finally, weakness is the evidence of surrender. Look at verse 31. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. And therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip and the sinew on the thigh. Okay, so weakness. Jacob is now tired from wrestling, and he's now walking with a limp. He is now vulnerable. He has been blessed by God personally and up close. Again, remember, Jacob's always asking for a blessing, and he wouldn't let God leave. He wouldn't let God depart until he had blessed him. He's always trying to be blessed. That's what he wants more than anything in the world. Now he's vulnerable. Now he's tired. And now he's changed. Because weakness is always the evidence that you've surrendered. Being okay with weakness is always the evidence that you're in a good place with God. Weakness is always the flag that is raised from our heart that we have wrestled rightly with God. The first thing that is pointed out here is we know we've surrendered when we let others see us weak. Literally, it's going to be told forever what happened to Jacob in the memorializing of some dietary restrictions. Vulnerability in community is evidence of surrender. If you sit in a circle with a bunch of Christians and you will only talk about your struggles in the past tense, you've not surrendered. You got to tell them how you're weak present tense, what you're struggling with present tense. Look at verse 1. Jacob lifted up his eyes, looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he goes out, weak and vulnerable. And everything that he has been afraid of his whole life is bearing down on him. And so he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two servants, and he put them in front, and then Joseph last of all, and they went on before. So he's literally now he's now no longer thinking about how to preserve himself. He's getting his family taken care of. And because we know we've surrendered when we let go of control, when we stop trying to control, when we are orientated to the well-being of others and not just using them as leverage, you know you've surrendered. When you are more process-orientated and not outcome-orientated, he doesn't know if his brother's going to kill him or not. No such promise has been made. The only difference is now he has wrestled with God, he has been blessed by God, and he willingly goes out tired and vulnerable to meet Esau. And in the process of doing so, he takes all of the vulnerable people and no longer uses them as leverage, but he assures their well-being. He's not trying to control. He's not trying to manipulate. He's fully surrendered. Last, look at verse 4. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him. He fell on his neck, and he kissed him, and they wept. And in verse 11, he says this, "Accept my blessing that is brought to you. God has dealt gracious with me because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. We know we've surrendered when God is enough. 'Cause enough. 'Cause 'enough. 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 'Cause ' want to show you something. And I just stumbled onto it today, actually an hour before I preached this sermon. And I know I'm over time, but I think I'm hearing God. I think Jacob has heard God. I'm going to take you back to Genesis chapter 27. Look at this next slide. It's the first of the series of 5 images. Just if you could just throw it up. And I'm hoping they have it because I just sent it to them just before I got up here. So here's what I did. I went back to Genesis chapter 27 where he takes his brother's blessing and birthright, okay? And here's what the text says. It says, "Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die." So that's Isaac speaking, and he uses a Hebrew verb to bless. Now, Hebrew is please bear with me I promise the payoff is good. Hebrew is very complicated language. Greek is much easier to study than Hebrew. Hebrew is very nuanced. You can't think of verbs in tenses like you do every other language. You have to think of verbs in aspects. You either have an imperfect aspect of a verb or you have a perfect aspect of a verb. And when the verb is imperfect, it literally means that something is still in progress. And when a verb is perfect in the aspect of Hebrew, it means that it's final and completed once and for all. Does that make sense? That's a rough Hebrew lesson for you, okay? So when Isaac says, "I'm going to bless you," when Jacob wants to be blessed, if you'll notice, this verb is in perfect or imperfect? Imperfect. Next slide. Again, he asks up in verse 10, "You shall bring it to your father to eat so that he may bless you before he dies." Now, Rebekah, his mother, is talking. That verb, to bless, is employed again, and is it perfect or imperfect? Imperfect. Next slide. Again, in verse 19, he says, now Jacob himself is talking, and he's masquerading and says, "I want you to bless me." Perfect or imperfect? Imperfect. Now leave that. Don't get ahead of me now. Don't get ahead of me. Okay? Now I did this really fast, so I'm going to at least say this definitively. That every time Jacob asks to be blessed, back in 27 of Genesis, the verb to bless is in the imperfect. Every time. In chapter 33, the text we're in now, Jacob says, "I'm not going to let you leave until you bless me." Same verb. Next slide. Next one. He changes the tense, the aspect. It's the first time he uses the perfect form of that verb. Why is that awesome? Because he's saying he doesn't want blessing for authority, but he wants blessing from the one who is in authority. He doesn't want a blessing that entitles him to earthly possessions. He finally, after striving his whole life trying to cheat people out of blessing, wants heavenly riches, not earthly possessions. He doesn't want a blessing to be the favored son of Isaac. He wants a blessing to be the redeemed son of Yahweh. He wants a perfect blessing. He wants the blessing. It's like he's finally saying, after wrestling with God as an old man, he's finally saying, you are enough. You are all I want. If you want me to march out there to my destruction and it brings you glory, I will do so. If you want me to endure this pain and this wickedness, I will do so if it brings you glory. If you want me to deny everything that I have ever desired for myself and for my children and for my life, I will do so if it brings you glory, because today you are finally enough. I hear you. The band can come up. How about you? We've come to the end of my sermon, and we have come to the end of my 3 parts on your desires. In Matthew 16, Jesus says, if anyone wants to come after me, deny yourself, lose your life, surrender your desires, and I will bless you in the perfect aspect of the Hebrew. Today is the day for some of you. You are stubborn and obstinate, and you are steaming towards Death Valley. Your fears are the enemy of surrender because you are letting them control you. It is time for you to take control back in the Spirit of God because of the gospel of God. There are areas of your life that these fears are revealing. You need to begin wrestling with God this morning. Personally, prolonged, and if necessary, it might be painful. And you'll know when you've surrendered. You'll know when you have finally risen the white flag of your heart in that area of your life. Because you'll let others see you weak. You'll let go of your control. And Jesus will be enough. That blessing will be enough.